The Analyzing Instrument, Unconscious Communication and Classical Psychoanalysis. A Historical Journey of Intersubjectivity and the Unconscious. Part 3. The Shift to Two-Person Psychology and Enactments. This sharp divide between the ego psychologists and those classically trained analysts interested in studying the unconscious aspects of the analytic dyad began to recede somewhat in the mid-1970s. A group of analysts, Paul Gray and his adherents, stayed true to the tradition of seeking a clinical approach that removed the analyst's subjectivity as a factor in the therapeutic relationship. Point 5, however, there emerged another circle that Chodorow, 2004, has termed intersubjective ego psychology. Intersubjective ego psychologists use the ego-psychological language of interpretation, individuality, autonomy, and insight, analytic neutrality, and other similar concepts, and also the language of enactment, transference, countertransference, the contribution of the analyst's mind and subjectivity, and other similar concepts that arose initially from interpersonal psychoanalysis. p. 210. This nascent shift of emphasis has also been described as a movement from a one-person to a two-person psychology, implied, according to Michael Balint, 1969, in Ferenczi's work. The term two-person psychology is first mentioned in a paper by John Rickman VI in 1951, who defined it as the psychological region of reciprocal relationships. Rickman, 1951, page 219. It is instructive in our efforts to trace the lineage of the concept of intersubjectivity to note that Rickman was first analyzed by Freud, later, like Balint, by Ferenczi, and then with Melanie Klein in London. Point 7. Thus, we can see tracings of Ferenczi's DNA across several analytic generations, its markings more apparent the closer we look, though his work is rarely cited by the so-called intersubjective ego psychologists. The evolution in classical analysis toward the psychological region of reciprocal relationships begins with a change in view of countertransference from an impediment of the analysis to an aid in understanding the inner world of the patient. The literature on countertransference is extensive, and I will limit myself to the issue of the psychological region of reciprocal relationships. In his classic 1976 paper, Countertransference and Role Responsiveness, Joseph Sandler introduced the idea that the transference has an intended purpose of actualizing an internal object relationship of the analysand in the analytic relationship. The patient assumes a certain role in accord with an internal fantasy and also deliberately, though unconsciously, acts to evoke in the analyst a complementary role of that fantasy. Sandler emphasizes that this role responsiveness is not just a fantasy existing in the patient's psyche, but is an actual state of emotional affairs that permeates the subjective experiences of the analyst and analysand. In this brief paper, Sandler is offering a widened view of transference to include what the analyst feels. The patient's transference would thus represent an attempt by him to impose an interaction, an interrelationship, in the broadest sense of the word, between himself and the analyst. Page 44, italics added. Accordingly, he adds to the analyst's task of maintaining free-floating attention the necessity of holding free-floating behavioral responsiveness, that is, a receptive capacity to being placed in a variety of roles that pull him in the direction of specific actions, delimited by the nature of the role he has been pushed to assume. The analyst may find himself placed into a role which causes some distress, and Sandler cautions him not to simply view this upset as a mere blind spot, but to consider his reaction as a compromise formation between his own proclivities and his reaction to the nature of the role forced upon him. Johnny, a 9-year-old boy in analysis for Encaprices, began a session by announcing, "Dr. Brown, today we're going to kill women." He motioned to the wall, said that there was a lineup of women whom I was supposed to shoot, and placed an imaginary gun in my hand. I was taken aback by this command and hesitated, offering that I did not know how to fire a weapon, but Johnny barked like an angry sergeant, "Do it." Still I hedged and said I didn't feel right killing these women, but my delaying was quickly remedied when Johnny turned me into an emotionless robot. His impatience with me grew until he held a rifle to my head and said, "It's them or you." Reluctantly I gave in, followed orders, and shot all the women. Returning to my human form, I said I felt badly about the murders, at which point Johnny gave me a puzzled look and said, "Dr. Brown, we were only playing." Johnny needed me to adopt the role of a murderer of women, but my anxiety about assuming that position caused my resistance. This resistance arose from a compromise formation between the role Johnny needed me to step into and my conflicts over matricidal feelings. I knew the women represented his mother. In drawing our attention to this blending of the analyst's psychology with the inner dynamics of the analysand, Sandler moved the classical analytic understanding of countertransference forward to include the patient's pressure on us to take on a role in his inner world and the effect upon the analyst in acquiescing. However, it is through the experience of that role responsiveness that we are able to gain knowledge of the patient's inner workings. Thus, when Johnny said, "Dr. Brown, we were only playing," it was as though he implicitly understood Sandler's technical suggestion that the analyst become one of the patient's inner objects. This task runs parallel with Fliess's idea of a trial identification, but is different in two ways. First, for Fliess, the trial identification was with a transference striving of the analysand, not a representation of the patient's inner object world. And second, Sandler was underscoring the importance of action. That transference involved a pressure on the analyst to take a specific action vis-a-vis the particular fantasy that was actualized in the here and now of the session. Finally, I want to note for future reference that Johnny, like Sam in the previous chapter, was quite tuned into my subjective reactions to the role he needed me to take. We will return to the topic of the patient's experience of the analyst's subjectivity in Chapter 3. The emphasis in Sandler's paper on the patient's pressure for us to assume a role and act it out provides a central theoretical grounding for the focus upon enactments 9 beginning in the analytic literature in the 1980s. In Sandler's concept of role responsiveness, it was the patient's inner world and its externalization into the analytic situation that spurred the analyst's involvement. That is, that the analyst's psyche was viewed as reactive rather than an active participant in initiating the interaction. Theodore Jacobs, 1991, has written extensively about the actualizing component of enactments, adding a two-person dimension that was essentially absent in Sandler's discussion, bringing us closer to the region of reciprocal relationships. The patient and analyst may engage in an unconscious mutual enactment that serves resistance. The enactments carried out by both patient and analyst may be seen as having opened the way not only to uncovering an essential piece of history that had not yet surfaced, but to bringing to the fore certain crucial aspects of the interaction between patient and analyst that, arousing anxiety in each and strongly defended by both, had until then been insufficiently explored. p. 40. For Jacobs, the analyst is typically drawn into an enactment because of his or her unconscious resonance with an aspect of the unconscious conflict that the patient is manifesting. Not uncommonly, the analyst identifies with an internal object of the patient who may represent a figure in the analyst's inner world or a split-off piece of him/herself. Jacobs, 1983. In this situation, personages from the analysand's representational world, Sandler and Rosenblatt, 1962, may become unknowingly linked with presences in the analyst's mind. Invariably, however, for Jacobs, an enactment and its successful analysis allows for the emergence and clarification of unconscious conflicts in the patient. Thus, an enactment is considered within the framework of the classically established goal of making the unconscious conscious. Other intersubjective ego psychologists similarly draw our attention to the mutuality involved in analytic enactments. Boesky, 1990, suggests that, in addition to helping to foster the conscious awareness of previously unconscious elements, another benefit to the analysts being drawn into an enactment is that the analysand senses the analyst's engagement with him or her. If the analyst does not get emotionally involved sooner or later in a manner that he had not intended, the analysis will not proceed to a successful conclusion. p. 573. Similarly, Ellman, 1998, states that development of analytic trust is bidirectional, and the patient's awareness that he or she has had such an impact on the analyst is an important factor in its formation. The patient must penetrate the analyst's psychological world, and the analyst must allow this penetration to be gradually perceptible to the patient. This process is at the heart of analytic trust. Page 187. Here Boesky and Ellman are beginning to introduce the notion of the patient's awareness of the analyst's subjectivity. However, this is a matter that intersubjective ego psychologists had largely left unexamined until very recently. Renick broke new ground in his 1993 paper, Analytic Interaction, Conceptualizing Technique in Light of the Analyst's Irreducible Subjectivity, which emphasized an aspect of the literature on enactments that he believed was underappreciated. Renick argued that enactments tended to be seen as useful because they represented the skillful recovery of an error, embedded in a theory of technique that directs the analyst to eliminate personally motivated action as much as he or she can. p. 555. Our technique, as Sandler, 1976, suggests, must allow for the inevitability of being drawn into an enactment, and Renick underscores the value of the analyst's self-analysis in order to grab hold of his or her irreducible subjectivity, activated in the clinical engagement. In later contributions, Routledge, 2004-2007, enlarges upon the perspective that successful analysis of an enactment is aimed at making the unconscious conscious by stating that insight is co-created by the analyst and patient as much as it is something discovered by the analyst and patient. 2004, page 1054, italics added. This comment marks a significant elaboration of the traditional analytic take on enactments as resistance to the emergence of repressed, and therefore preformed, memories, fantasies, and analogous phenomena in the patient and/or the analyst. Instead, Routledge puts it quite simply. That analytic truths are co-created by analyst and patient, rather than unveiled by means of the analyst's objective observations of the patient's projections. 2004, page 1056. Thus, Routledge is moving the focus of the intersubjective encounter in the analytic dyad away from the discovery of buried hidden truths, i.e., repressed facts to be dispassionately unearthed, described, and examined, to the co-creation of new constructions, i.e., a developing sense of the truth as a shared emotional construct that bear the personal stamp of each participant, thereby putting to rest the quixotic quest for a technique to guarantee that no instinctual additions of our own distort the picture. Flies, 1942, page 219. It has been axiomatic from early psychoanalytic days that the analyst's emotional equilibrium is susceptible to being shaken, sometimes quite severely, by the demands of doing analysis. Though it was never stated explicitly, the obverse of this danger is that the potential disruption of the analyst might also result in emotional growth. Theodore Rake, 1948, may have been the first to identify what he termed the reciprocal illumination of unconscious happenings, page 397, by which analyzing another allowed the possibility of the analyst penetrating to profounder depths, page 397, in his or her associated self-analytic work, an idea hinted at by Freud, 1910a, when he stated that no psychoanalyst goes further than his own complexes and internal resistances permit. P. 145. I italicized the word reciprocal in order to highlight the interconnection between the analytic work each member of the dyad undertakes. Blum, 1980, in discussing the topic of reconstruction, states that when the analyst offers a reconstruction of the patient's childhood, this may be useful to the analyst as well because reconstruction of the analyst's childhood and reconstruction of the patient's childhood are quite separate if at times reciprocal processes, page 49, italics added. Jacobs, 1991, delineates the process of this reciprocal growth. It is through the analyst's associations in his or her own life with the analysand's narrative that he or she is able to truly understand the patient's troubles. Therefore, any reworking of the patient's inner world is inevitably linked with analogous reorganizing in the analyst's psyche. The so-called intersubjective ego psychologists have significantly broadened our knowledge of how two minds may work reciprocally to create behavioral enactments of unconscious forces. These interactions are initiated by some inner conflict of the patient that is actualized in the session and has an animating effect upon related conflicts in the analyst. Through his self-analysis, the analyst detects his identification with some aspect of the analysand's unrecognized conflict, information that the analyst employs to gain some sense of an unconscious problem in the patient that can now be made conscious through an interpretation that is partly based on the analyst's knowledge gleaned from his countertransference. Ellman, 1998, has importantly accentuated the need for a bidirectional analytic trust, but the intersubjective ego psychologists do not explore the bidirectional nature of mutual influence between analyst and patient. Boesky and Ellman hint at it, but typically these analysts do not address the impact on the analysand of having an analyst drawn into a particular enacted role. In addition, the text of the enacted narrative is viewed as scripted by an actualized internal fantasy, Sandler, of the patient or by a previously camouflaged memory of the analysand, Jacobs, that has been unconsciously expressed in the enactment. Finally, though Chodorow, 2004, calls these analysts ego psychologists, they do not discuss the role of the ego as a structure of either patient or analyst in this intersubjective encounter. A notable exception is Jacobs' 1986 paper that dealt with the analyzing instrument in which he referred to the shared regressed ego states of the analytic dyad that may result in the appearance of visual images.